Well, good evening and a very, very warm welcome to this evening's Tackling Life event from Christchurch, Cambridge. Great to welcome you and great to be able to tackle this subject for this evening, COVID on my mind. My name is Steve Midgley. I'm a Senior Minister at Christchurch, Cambridge. And I'm going to be joined in a little bit by Helen Thorne, who's our guest this evening as we think this through. And I'll introduce Helen and we'll get her to say a little bit about herself in just a minute. I guess all of us are hearing lots in the media about the mental health impacts of the pandemic, but perhaps more acutely, all of us are probably experiencing something of that impact, whether it's at low grade or much more pronounced. At the very least, many of us thinking, oh, why am I so tired all the time? Nothing quite feels right, and I feel so flat. Or it may be that we're aware of struggles in people around us, a flatmate, a spouse, children, and we're thinking, oh, they're just not their normal selves, and I don't quite know what's up with them, and I don't quite know how to help. Those are the sorts of things that we're going to try and say a little bit about this evening. Of course, in very general ways, but I hope to some small degree, it'll be a helpful evening for you over the next hour. Let me tell you about the format for this evening. As I say, in a moment, I'm going to introduce Helen and get her to tell us a little bit about herself. And then she and I are going to spend about 30 minutes or so in conversation together. And then a little bit of a pause in the middle before we open it up to any questions or comments that you might have about this evening's material. And should explain that the way to feed in questions is through a website called Pigeonhole, and you'll see the address for that website going across the bottom of the page at the moment. You can hop over there and punch in a question. You're also able to go over there and see the questions that have been asked at any stage, and you can actually vote for them, which is actually a bit more than just a little bit of fun and a little bit of a gimmick, because almost certainly we'll end up with more questions than we can possibly manage in the little space of time. So it really does help to know which issues seem to be particularly important on people's minds to hear more about. So that's a useful thing to us. Probably worth acknowledging my own sort of interest and background in this area. Before I became a church minister, I worked as a psychiatrist for some years, and I now am involved with an organisation called Biblical Counselling UK, which is an organisation that tries to bring the resources of the Christian faith to bring benefit and help to people who are struggling. But let's meet with Helen and let me get her to join us. I think she's going to pop up on screen. There we go. Helen, why are you muted? Why does it say muted on your microphone? Is that Ben need to sort that out? I can see a little. That's better. Perfect. Helen, welcome. Thanks for joining us for tonight. Good to have you with us. Tell us a little bit about where in the country you're from and what do you do?
I'm based in southwest London on the Surrey borders, living in the Surbiton, Wimbledon kind of area. And I work for you. We ought to be upfront about this, shouldn't we? Steve is my boss. I work for Biblical Counselling UK, and I'm the Director of Training and Resources there.
Yes, so there we go. Performance-related pay is obviously what we have in mind for this evening. No. So, Helen, we're going to have this conversation about kind of mental health in the pandemic. We're going to think about it particularly with a kind of Christian angle. So, I wanted just to let people get to know you a bit, to know why you're thinking these things through with us. Just tell us background to those. What means that you've done some thinking in the whole mental health area? You know, how does your work involve you in that area?
Well, my work is it's a joy and a privilege, really, to be able to go around different churches around England, around the UK, sometimes around the world, helping them think about what difference God makes when life is really hard. I'd probably do it for free. I shouldn't tell you that, should I? But it is such a delight to be able to think about, how God can help us when life is just crashing down, and how he can spur us on, and how he's so worth it when times are very difficult. But I guess to backtrack a bit, there's probably a reason why I got into that kind of work in the first place. And that is because in my own life, I know what it is for life to just fall apart completely, to feel completely in the bottom of the pit, face down in the mud, and to know the difference that God makes in times like that. And so when I'm talking about mental health issues, when I'm talking about faith issues, I'm hoping I'm relatively well read, but it's not just coming from a book. It's coming from a life that is wholeheartedly rooted in the fact that I've only been able to get through periods of my life because of the wonder of God.
And Helen, you're gonna have people listening thinking, well, what does she mean by that? Would it be okay to just sort of push you any further and just give us a little bit of a flavour about what you mean by sort of being in stuck in the mud and feeling overwhelmed?
Sure. So my childhood was pretty chaotic in lots of ways. Sorry, I realised I haven't put my phone on silent, which is desperately bad practice, isn't it? You don't want to hear my pings coming in. My childhood was relatively chaotic, a loving family, but a family that was in a lot of pressure because my mum lost a number of babies, and that's never an easy thing for a mum and a dad to be experiencing. And so I grew up in a relatively isolated way, in a way that was quite full of pain and grief. And that meant I was quite vulnerable growing up. And unfortunately, it meant that I crossed paths with a paedophile and came under his control for quite some time. Hugely painful experiences in childhood, which clearly had quite a bit of a legacy in the teenage years and going on. I soon became a very anxious child. I was a sort of child that would never say anything, which no one can quite believe now. But I was really shy. I couldn't string two words together confidently. Very anxious, always hiding, always wanting to be on my own. And as I became a teenager, these things started to work out in very self-destructive behaviours. So initially, I basically stopped eating. I had an eating disorder. When I was about 15, I moved on to self-harm and was regularly cutting myself and taking overdoses. By the time I was at university, I was drinking really heavily as well. And the despair of all of that mingled in some pretty spectacular ways into lots of occasions when I really just didn't want to carry on at all. My upbringing didn't have any religion in it. My parents weren't particularly churchgoers. I mean, we popped along to church occasionally because my mum was a brown owl and I used to go to church and I waved a flag and, it was all quite fun, but there was no sense of who God was in there.
So sort of arriving in your early 20s with life. I mean, you've described a pretty chaotic and pretty sort of, as you say, self-damaging kind of experience at that stage. So loads of exposure to struggle and difficulty. What happened at that point?
So I was at university and some friends of mine said, Helen, I really think you need some help. And they weren't wrong. And so I went off and got some help from the University Counselling Centre. They suggested I went into a sort of an outpatient rehab programme, which was entirely on the NHS. And I thought that was a good idea. And a lovely couple who I knew from my childhood offered to sponsor me through it. They happened to be Christians. But that wasn't part of the deal when they offered to sponsor me through rehab. They were just two lovely people who wanted to help me out.
And sponsor you mean by being alongside you during the rehab program, sort of providing some sort of structure and support.
Structure, support, encouragement, holding me accountable, making sure I got to sessions and things like that. And I was an absolute brat to them, actually. I was really horrible. I used to throw the most monumental tantrums. And I used to tell them I hated them. I used to tell them I wish they'd leave me alone. I used to storm out of their house and slam the door behind me. I was just in such turmoil at the time, that things went from bad to worse very quickly. But they kept on loving me and kept on encouraging me and kept on welcoming me back into their home and kept on saying that I could get through this and they weren't going to go anywhere. And I think I came to the conclusion after a little while that either their faith made a massive difference to them or they were nuts. It could have gone either way. In fact, in some occasions, I think they probably were just nuts. But because I considered the possibility that their faith was making a difference to how they were treating me, one Christmas when they invited me round to their house for mince pies and a Christmas communion service, I decided to give it a bit of a whirl.
And this is sort of what, 2022, 20, something like that?
Just a bit earlier than that. I was still at uni at this point, yeah.
Right, okay. So that was so really that was first serious exposure to the Christian faith in your kind of early 20s. How, I mean, I know now because we know each other, you're a committed Christian sort of, follower of Jesus. How long did it take for you, as you began to think about the Christian faith? Was that many years of sort of thinking it through? Are we talking about something that sort of happened very suddenly?
I'm quite a question asker. So I spent a good 6 to 7 months asking questions at church, asking my pastors and asking my friends, well, what does this bit of the Bible mean? How does this work? How can, God be like this? Why would he allow this to happen? All those kind of normal questions that people have. And after about 7 months, I considered the possibility of then deciding to follow Jesus the rest of my life. I listened to a number of talks, and at the end of every single talk, I went, actually, no, I'm not sure this is for me. Until one day I heard a talk. I honestly can't remember what the talk was about, but it was that moment where I suppose God kind of grabbed my heart and I was going, yes, I want to follow you. This is worth it. This makes sense. This feels true. And this is the God that I want to trust in for the rest of my life.
And instantaneous, dramatic turnaround of your life, and all of your old problems disappeared overnight, I'm sure.
Yeah, not quite, no. So on one level, everything became different. I had hope, I had a faith, I had a community, all those things changed really suddenly. But now I spent the next 10 years of my life in and out of rehab. I'm not someone that actually changes particularly quickly. I find life messy, I find life hard. And so I went into rehab twice more in the first 10 years of being a Christian. And it wasn't until I'd been a Christian for about 10 years that I think I properly started joining all the dots between my struggles and my faith, and gradually things started to work out. I've been a Christian, 31 years now. I'm still not sorted out. I still struggle. I still get tempted. I still feel down. But it's a massively different experience now. So it's certainly no miraculous turning around the moment I became a Christian. A slow walk of faith over many decades and a gradual untangling of what was going on in my life.
Helen, thank you for being willing to just share that. I guess we could spend the rest of the hour we got together just exploring that in a little bit more detail. But we've advertised it's COVID on my mind, so we ought to stick with that. We will stick with that. So let's shift gears then. We now know a little bit about why you have an interest in mental health, and we also know how it is you came to have an interest in the Christian faith. Just give us some of your reflections, if you could, about the kind of things that you are seeing. I know you do a fair bit of counselling in a church setting. Tell me about some of the things that you're seeing people struggle with through the sort of the past year of the pandemic.
I think one of the things that people are saying most commonly is how tired we all are. I think everyone is just feeling exhausted at the moment. There have been so many new things coming at us so thick and fast, having to learn new ways of doing school, new ways of working, new ways of shopping, new ways of doing church. It all feels so new. I think we're exhausted. And with that,
putting those two things together, so you think it's it's the constantly being faced with new things that we have to think through fresh that is exhausting. So the removal of routines that are relatively low energy demand, is that what you?
Yeah, so I think that's at least part of it. I mean, I think some of us are just a lot busier, or some of us are a lot less stimulated, and those things can feed into exhaustion as well.
Okay.
But I think it is a lack of routine and all of the new stuff coming at us that really does exhaust us in exceptional ways. And I think when we get exhausted, we see all kinds of other things cropping up, like anxiety tends to kick in a bit more quickly. Anger tends to kick in a bit more quickly. That's why we've seen in the news a big rise in things like domestic abuse. People are talking about being stressed. Some people are talking about being massively overstimulated. Often people in families where they're working at home, doing school at home, everyone's in the same four walls for 22, 23 hours of the day, and there's just noise and stimulation coming at them the whole time. Whereas other people, and maybe I'm personally a bit more on this end of the spectrum, you're in your four walls completely alone all the time. And there's nothing coming at you, no physical contacts, of course your phone's going occasionally, but it's a lot quieter than it normally is. And so there's those stimulation issues that we're struggling with. And people are looking for release in all kinds of different directions. And so a lot of people are coming saying that they're using porn now, whereas they'd stopped years ago, but they started again. People are saying, well, I've always enjoyed a little bit of a drink at the end of the day, but I can feel it getting out of control now. People going to things like gambling, having struggles with things like exercise. Sometimes an occasional run felt good, but now it feels absolutely essential, and life falls apart if you're not getting that exercise. And so people are struggling in such a wide variety of ways. I think we could probably spend the next hour just listing them all if we really wanted to.
I've heard some people describe it as a sort of, a kind of intensification. If we had any tendencies, if a marriage was struggling a little bit, that struggle has been intensified by the throwing together. If people have been feeling a little bit low and a little bit sort of isolated, again, that's been intensified by the current experience. And I found that sort of image of whatever was already around a little bit, maybe there was already a low grade level of domestic abuse, and that's true, has been intensified by the pressure on a situation, and it's got a lot worse, and people are in real trouble in that way. I'm interested also whether you can bounce this one back at me if you like, but I would be interested in your thoughts. There is more isolation. I mean, the very nature of lockdown is the idea of we're being restricted, where there's less social contact. We're doing this screen stuff more, but we're less exposed to kind of just the ordinary run-of-the-mill bits of life. How do you think that is affecting us?
I think human beings are designed for community, and therefore when you take that community away, there's just that natural instinctual feeling that something is wrong. I know for me, as someone living on my own, one of the things that I've struggled with most is the lack of touch. It's not so bad now. We have this wonderful invention called a bubble. I now have a 6-year-old from another family that uses me as a climbing frame, and that's a delight. But I remember in the first lockdown, I think I went through about 6 months without touching another human being. No hug, no handshake, all those things that you naturally interact with people on. And I'm a really tactile person. So that in itself just felt like there's a part of me was missing. I could almost feel my skin crawling from the lack of stimulation that it was having.
Did you realise that straight away? How quickly were you aware that was an issue?
It took weeks, I think. I think after a couple of weeks, I felt that something's weird, something's not right. And it didn't take me, it took me a little while longer to go, oh yeah, I haven't actually touched anything that's living, other than, a half dead tulip or something like that. It doesn't really count.
Well, and your cat.
Well, yeah, they just tend to bite. It's not the same.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But there is that sense, and there's less communication, there's less encouragement, there's And what encouragement and conversation we do have, it's mediated via screens, which means we're not getting people's voice intonation quite like we normally do. We're not getting people's body language quite like what we normally do. And therefore, communication just feels rather more stilted than it ever has before.
Yeah. I was fascinated. I was listening to a friend of mine speaking around the part of what you're saying about what relationships do to us, and his comment was that he was very glad that he's married, and he was very glad that in his marriage he's got a wife who calls him out, and if he's being weird, she says, "Look, Ed, you're being weird now. Stop that." And I thought that was fascinating. And then I thought, actually, in a strange kind of way, the separation that we're experiencing from kind of normal life is we're being separated from the influence of the world, which just pulls us out of our oddnesses. We've all got funny little habits or kind of, peculiarities or little sort of tram lines that we can find ourselves sort of, channeled down. And the world sort of pulls us out of that just because we're constantly bumping up, with other people and relationships and so on. And that's a little bit dangerous for us, I think, somehow.
Absolutely. And I think we often see that on social media as well, which is often where we're getting most of our contact at the moment. I think things just feel like the energy's been ramped up, and things like conspiracy theories, and I'm not going to try and name anybody because I'll light some blue touch paper somewhere, just seem to be much more prevalent because we're finding it a lot easier to let our thoughts spiral in ways that maybe they normally wouldn't.
So there's plenty, I suppose we might say, in our changed circumstances that are affecting us. What do you want to say a little bit more about what you think it's sort of what's happening on the inside? Because you mentioned a whole range of reactions. Sometimes anxiety, sometimes depression, sometimes sort of addictive behaviours, sometimes anger. It sounds almost too general a question, but I don't know if you can make something of it to say, what contribution are we making? What's going on that we are reacting badly to difficulties out there?
Yeah, thank you. I think in any given situation where we're responding to something, whether that's responding with anger or anxiety or an addiction, it's always a combination of stuff that's coming at us and stuff that's coming out of us. So often the stuff coming at us at the moment is COVID, though let's face it, there are still plenty of non-COVID related pressures coming at us day by day. But there's also stuff coming out of us that interacts with those external stimuli. What do I mean by that? Well, there are things like biological factors. So some of us might be genetically predisposed to anxiety. Some of us might be on medication that already makes us feel a little bit down. So when those external pressures combine with those biological factors, that will mean we have a response of some nature. It's not always biology, though. Sometimes, as you already said, we've got pre-existing behaviours like maybe a bit of a drink dependency. So if you combine a bit of a drink dependency coming out of us with COVID coming at us, that can easily push towards an addiction to alcohol. Similarly, with anger coming out of us or a tendency to be grumpy, combine that with COVID and the volume gets turned up. And that's when we have more extreme angry outbursts, possibly even abuse. But there are also beliefs coming out of us as well. And when they combine with the external factors, they can drive us in all kinds of different directions. So, for example, maybe we believe that life ought to be ordered. Now, if we believe that life ought to be ordered and then something like COVID comes at us, that's a massive crunch point because our belief that life should be under control gets a massive curveball. But if we are more of a go with the flow kind of person and say, actually, I'll take whatever comes at me any day, COVID coming at us might have a slightly different impact on our hearts. And we'll hold those beliefs in different kind of strengths, if you like. So a general like of having things in order is not going to be hit desperately hard by COVID. But if we're the kind of person that already before COVID, we feel our life is going to fall apart if we're not planned every step of the way, if we don't know what our diary is going to be doing for the next month, if we are maybe over controlled, if I can use that word, something like COVID coming at us can floor us massively, because you can't control much in the middle of a pandemic. And so if you have a belief system that I need to be able to control stuff, then the pandemic is going to hit us particularly hard.
That's very helpful, to tease out that combination of, as you say, things coming at us, but also, things that come out of us, as well. You want to say something about how good or bad you think, or how hard we find it to seek out help? Because that you mentioned earlier on, it took you a while to notice the absence of physical touch. So until you notice it, it's hard to do something about it. But similarly, if we are noticing a sort of a swelling of anxiety and fear, I know that my instinct in that situation is to try and sort myself out. I feel that sort of feel as though I ought to just try harder. How does that feed into some of these struggles with our psychological well-being?
I mean, we're all wired slightly differently. Some of us are more open than others. Some of us have a circle of friends that we find it easier to chat to than others. And those kind of factors are going to play into how easy we find it to seek help. But I think a lot of us have that sense in which we ought to be able to cope. We ought to be able to hold it together. We ought to be able to get through this. And the reality is some days we just can't. And it can be really hard to articulate that. I think sometimes in the busyness of life, we just not sure if we've got time to take the cork out the bottle and see what might be lurking underneath. Sometimes we just aren't convinced that people love us enough to want to listen. Sometimes we think the people around us do care, but they're just too busy or too stressed handling their own struggles. And sometimes we just want to hide. Sometimes we don't want people to know the real us. And if that's the case, then we probably are not going to ask for help.
I find myself, as you describe that, I find myself thinking about the couple who, what do you say, sponsored you right back in those days, and I just find myself thinking, you were saying that for a lot of that time you were pretty sort of mean to them, and that's a funny mixture, isn't it? I mean, that's a very real lived example of you needing help being available, and actually bizarrely you really resisting receiving it and actually making it, sort of pushing back against it. We do that, don't we? And I'm struck, in a sense from my own. I mean, I became a Christian same sort of stage of life as you in my early 20s, and again the hardest thing for me at that point was being willing to acknowledge a need for God. That actually there was a God who made me. There was a God who was, kind of, so I came to realize, reaching out to me. And actually, mostly I was pushing him away because I didn't like that idea of needing to depend upon him. And I wonder if something similar to that goes on. There's something built into that, that manifests itself in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think most of us like to be independent. Most of us like to think we can sort ourselves out. It actually takes quite a lot of courage and boldness, humility, a whole heap of things that certainly don't come very naturally to me, to go, you know what? I'm on the floor. I can't do this by myself. I need help. And whether we're asking of that help from our friends and family, or whether we're asking that help from God, it does mean openly and honestly admitting we're weak and needy. And sometimes that's just hard.
Let's sort of, let's push a little bit further in that direction, if we may, by thinking, okay, we've identified some of the things that people might be struggling with at the moment. How can we either seek out help, or perhaps many of us might be in a situation where we want to try and be helpful to somebody else. What can you describe some sort of practical ways of helping somebody who we can see is kind of struggling, feeling low, feeling anxious, whatever it might be? Again, this is horrible because I'm asking you to be very general, but are there some general things that you think we can suggest?
Yeah, there are always things that you can do to encourage another human being, and there's some very simple, practical things that we can encourage each other to do. Going for a walk together, where that's possible. I know it's 2 by 2 at the moment rather than bigger groups, but if that can be arranged, that's a wonderful thing. Making sure people are eating healthily. I've actually got a little deal going with one of my best friends. I have vegetable accountability, because my own personal tendency when I'm really stressed is to live off a diet of ginger nuts. And, I'm a big fan of the ginger nut, but it doesn't cover all your food groups particularly. And so they just bring me a meal once a week, and it's an absolute joy and delight. And I take other people meals which are healthy as well. Having a bit of a routine, making sure people are connected, using things like WhatsApp, writing notes to people, just reminding them that they're loved. And then on a more sort of specialist level, I suppose, but still not desperately specialised, if people are feeling anxious, helping them with their breathing. The more anxious we get, the more we tend to breathe shallowly. Actually, breathing deeply has a physiological impact on our anxiety levels, in through the nose and out through the mouth, nice and slowly. Practicing grounding techniques when we're feeling panicky, the most simple, just touching our fingers against our thumb, bit by bit. It just gives a physical stimuli to bring you to the present rather than letting your brain spiral into the future. And then thinking about, putting boundaries in place, getting rest. If you're feeling overstimulated, how can you have 10 minutes of quiet with maybe some earbuds in so you can't hear the children screaming? If you're feeling understimulated, how can you have a nice warm bath which gives you a feeling of being enveloped with some nice music playing? Just think about what you're lacking and how you can make that up. And be creative and practical using music and art and words and exercise and food, just to remind people they're part of a community that cares, and there are simple ways that they can help look after themselves and others.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. And what about just asking people, inviting people to talk a little bit about the things they're struggling with? Is that something that you think we should be doing more of? I worry sometimes that we kind of feel as though that's sort of we need to leave that to experts, but at a sort of a simple, straightforward friendship level, to just be able to say, how are things? Tell me a bit about, how it's going for you at the moment. Is that something that you think we should be doing more of?
Absolutely. I mean, there are a place for experts, and do use GPs and counsellors and people like that when you need to. But it's just wonderful to have someone say, "How are you doing?" And then when they answer fine, it's like, no. How are you doing really? That question, just it being asked, always lightens my heart, because I think they care. They want to know the real me. They don't want the superficial facade of me, and that's a beautiful thing. Now, we have to be realistic. If someone says they're not okay, we can't fix them. We can't pour limitless amounts of time and energy into them. But we can do what we can. And actually, little moments of building community can be hugely transformational.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. We're going to take a little bit of a pause and then see some questions or comments that we might want to respond to. But before we do that, most of the things that we've picked out so far are, kind of, sort of common sense, practical advice that we can all benefit from. Do you want to tease out any more specific sort of ways in which, for you, the Christian faith has made a difference? You kind of hinted at that earlier on, but can I kind of tease that out a bit more? Are there particular ways in which who God is and what He promises that can make a real difference in the here and now?
I think stressful circumstances like COVID encourage us to believe some lies about ourselves and lies about the world around us. I don't mean that in any kind of judgmental way. I think that's just naturally how things work. So if we're in a sort of sense of social isolation, then we can feel like we're all on our own, that nobody cares. If we look at the news, we can feel like everything is spiraling out of control. We can feel like there's no good in the world because we're just being bombarded with negative things. And I think my faith gives me a lens to see life through, which is nowhere near as bleak as maybe some of the news we're getting would have us believe. So whereas, in the middle of a stressful day, I might be thinking, oh my goodness, I'm all alone. I've got my faith, I've got God, I've got the Bible saying, hang on, no, I'm with you. I'm God, I'm everywhere, I love you, and I'm with you right now. I'm a God who's present. I've got my mind going, oh, it's all spiraling out of control. But then I've got God and I've got the Bible saying, but no, this is under control. It's hard. There's no denying it's hard. But this is not a world spiraling out of control. God's got a plan, and that plan is leading somewhere good. I can have that sense of, but I can't do this. I'm so tired. I'm so stressed. There's so much on my to-do list. But I've got God whispering in my ear, but I'm equipping you for this. I'm living inside you. I'm here. I'm enabling you to do this day by day. That makes a difference. I can sit there going, but I'm so scared of the future. I've got a friend in hospital fighting COVID right now. I'm genuinely scared for them. And God in his word is saying to me, but I'm your rock. I'm your refuge. When you're scared, run to me. Come to me. And I will give you protection. And in the middle of COVID times, I just don't know where to go next. I don't know where to turn. I'm so confused. And God in the Bible is saying, but, I'm here to lead you. I'm here to help you navigate these difficult times. Lift your eyes away from the earth and to heaven, and see the bigger picture, see the hope, see the certainty, see the peace, see the joy that is there. And that will help you navigate through these times.
Okay, let me ask the cynic's question, Helen, at this point before we go to a break. Because a cynic would say, well, that's nice and comforting, and a bit of wishful thinking like that is a delight. Think about something negative and sort of whistle in the wind. Believe in a fairy godmother that's going to make things better. On what grounds do you have for that being anything more than I hope in a God who's going to make everything better in the end?
My faith is a faith, and therefore I can't have evidence for absolutely everything that I believe about God. That's part of faith, but it's a rational faith, Christianity. It's based on the Bible, historical documents from eyewitness accounts, and it introduces us to a man called Jesus who lived and walked the earth and did some incredible things. And I guess my confidence is based in him, on what he said, what he did, what other people saw him do, what other people wrote down what he did, and the impact that it's had on their lives, and the very experiential impact that it's had on my life. I'm not someone that gets particularly...
And you talked about the 6 or 7 months when you were asking lots of questions. Is that what you were doing in those 6 or 7 months? Were you particularly kind of reading about and discovering the historical life of Jesus? Was that the focus?
A lot of it was, yes. I did a little bit of reading about, well, why should I trust this book called the Bible? Surely it's so old we can't have any reliable manuscripts left. And you trace back and you think, actually, there is an awful lot of manuscript evidence for the Bible going back a long, long time. You look at the person of Jesus and you think, actually, no one would make up a story like that. That's it's if you were about to do something fictional, you'd make up something that was very different to the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
And so getting rooted and stuck into what is historical, what is credible, looking at the textual evidence is all very important. Clearly don't have time to go into that. Maybe we can have another evening on that another time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm struck by, you're kind of putting both of those things before us, a kind of a historical kind of appraisal of the Christian faith, but also you mentioned your own experiential kind of encounter as well.
Yeah,
we're running out of time to get to the questions, and I don't want to let people down over that. So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of pause in a moment. Let me just say one or two things about stuff from here. I suppose the first thing to say is if any of the things that Helen's just been talking about with regard to the historical life of Jesus of interest, I mean, an obvious place to do would be to read an account of his life. And you can just find one of the gospel accounts online, I'm sure. If you prefer to have a paper copy, then you could email our church office and give us a postal address, and we will post one to you. If you would find that helpful. And the other thing I was going to mention coming up is that we've got a course starting soon, a number of evenings. This course, Christianity Explored, which is going to be happening online and is an examination of those historical records of the person of Jesus Christ in Mark's account of his life. And you'd be very welcome to join that. What we're going to do now is just to give a pause and for Helen and I to take a look at any questions or comments that have come in. Very briefly, we're going to watch a little video. This is kind of teaser trailer, really, for that course, Christianity Explored. And it'll just give Helen and I a moment to look at the questions. So Ben's going to play that for us, and then we'll be right back.
What's the best news you've ever heard?
Grand. Ben, let's drag Helen back onto the screen. Would be lovely. Helen, there we are. I don't know whether you've had a chance to see some of the questions. It took me a while to track them down. So I've had completely ages. I wish that trailer was about 10 times longer. Okay, here we go. Here's a good first one, which has actually got most votes here, which is, how do you know you need help? Given the health system's overwhelmed, and we're hearing lots about people who are sort of holding themselves back and letting things get worse than they really are, getting worse than they should be before they seek help. How do you know when you should say this is getting too bad? I need to seek out some sort of professional help.
That's a really good question, and unfortunately it's not one of those really simple to answer questions, but I think some basic principles would include things like when you're struggling to do daily life, when you're struggling to sleep, when you're struggling to get up in the morning, when you're and struggling consistently over a period of maybe a few weeks. You know, we all have bad days when we don't want to get out of bed. We all have the odd sleepless night, but when that becomes a pattern, or when your relationships are in trouble because your angry outbursts are actually damaging the relationships, those are certainly signs to get some help. But I think if we're all being open and honest with at least one or two friends, that's a really good a guide. It means we've all got a little bit of an outlet. So if it's only fairly low level stuff and we just need someone saying, come on, you can do it, we can allow our friends to do that. But we're also allowing our friends enough information for them to go, hang on a second, this is way beyond you struggling a little. I've never seen you this low. Please go and see your GP. So letting other people into the conversation and helping them to discern is probably a good idea.
Which kind of also taps into something we were saying earlier, which is the willingness to ask people how they're doing and to probe a little bit. I mean, you know, because often it's that conversation that enables people to begin to recognise their own struggle. It happens in conversation. Okay, good. I'm going to bash through a few of these because there's some really good questions here. And we'll do this one first. Here's somebody saying, I struggle with health anxiety. I feel like I'm on constant alert and fearful self-monitoring over COVID issues all the time. I'm a Christian believer and yet struggle to get over this and really trust God. Do you have any advice in that context? I'm feeling bad that I'm throwing all the questions at you, but
yeah, well, no, I'll throw them back at you. Don't worry, it's all good. It's a really good question, and I'm really sorry that you're struggling like that. You're not alone. There are a lot of people struggling with health anxiety because we are being encouraged, to be scared of a virus at the moment, and that does feed into health anxiety quite a lot. I think remembering of God, the goodness of God, his kindness, the fact that he is with you in this and leading you through it will be helpful in that. I think talking to friends, actually verbalizing our anxieties can help us look at them more objectively and see which ones actually, no, that's a really reasonable thing to be scared of, and actually, hang on a second, maybe my thoughts are spiraling at that point. It might be that some medication is useful. It might be that some counselling to help think about where some of the roots of this health anxiety may have come from is useful. But I think for the moment, keep talking, keep reminding yourself that it's good and fair to be taking precautions at a time like this, and indeed important to be taking precautions. But actually keep reminding yourself that there is safety and there is security and nothing is out of control.
Yeah,
talk to the Lord in prayer as well. He's great.
Yeah, and I think remember who God is. I'm struck by you're talking about some of Jesus's teaching specifically, and I'm struck that in some of the places where Jesus talks particularly about worry and fear, the thing that he wants us to know is the greatness of God. That we put ourselves in perspective in relation to God. And I think sometimes our experiences of anxiety and actually sometimes our experiences of anger are all because we've allowed our own view of ourselves to become too big. And to get ourselves back in perspective helps. I'm going to jump to this one now, I think. Teenagers taking exams. I'm really struck by the way that, sorry, this is me ad-libbing now, but I'm really struck by the way that both people doing gap years have been completely kiboshed, but also, as this question makes clear, teenagers taking exams have faced lots of change. Even if they're on top of their work, still remains lots of uncertainty. Any particular advice? Well, actually, yeah, let me expand on this question. Any particular advice both for them, if you're giving advice directly to the teenager, but then also for people around them, maybe particularly parents who can see that they've got teenage children who are struggling and not sure how to help. There you go. Just sort that out for us in the next couple of minutes.
Yeah. It's a huge question, isn't it? And so many teenagers struggling at the moment. I think encouraging them to talk and to verbalise their struggles is really important. Teenagers can quite easily go in on themselves and do a lot of internal processing. And like we were saying, we need external voices to actually help us what is real and what is not so real or not so helpful. So actually keeping a dialogue going and help them think through who it's going to be helpful to talk about these things with. Obviously, going to want to talk about their friends about these things. That's absolutely fine. But talking them through the dangers of going onto anonymous chat rooms to talk about these things, because there it can get a little bit darker, maybe, and some of the things that get said about hopelessness a little bit more serious, and you want to guard against that. But I think reminding them that actually exams or no exams, these feel like big things in their lives, and they are, on one level, they are probably some of the biggest things coming up in their lives at their age. But I mean, let's think about most of us. I don't know how old we are on this call. I can't see anybody, but I'm guessing most of us are well past our teenage years, and can honestly say that a lot of what we did at GCSEs or A levels is not impacting us greatly. And so giving people the perspective that these exams, this age and stage is important, but what happens in the next 12 months doesn't make or break their lives. This isn't the big thing that's going to set them on the course to greatness or destroy them. This is, these are just exams, and that's not something that necessarily comes naturally to them, but it's a good thing to say. But again, remembering the sovereignty of God, the equipping of God, remembering that we've got a shepherd in God who leads us through the highs and the lows, the valleys, the mountains, the tough times, and encouraging them to keep their eyes on God and his purposes, rather than maybe some confusing messages coming out of political arenas is more important.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. That's very helpful. I think the only thing I would add to that, which is partly something that I wish I had clearer in my mind. I think it was only as our children got towards the end of their teens that it dawned on me how much more listening I should have done. I think, I can just think back to lots of occasions when, I begin to listen and then I can't resist starting to speak. And I sort of go into lecture mode, and I instantly think, I know what needs to be said. And I can think back to a time when actually I was speaking to one of my son's friends, and I realized I was listening to him much better because he wasn't my child, so I didn't need to tell him everything. And it dawned on me that I should have just, that the value of doing that more with our own children, and just being prepared to listen a little bit longer, and really understand what's going on for them. Okay, here's another one. I like this one, and so do other people. I'm being very sort of good, actually. I'm taking all of the top voted ones so far. If the pandemic ends quite soon and things revert back to the old normal to a large extent, do you think we'll have a lot of trouble changing back to this way after, say, 18 months of this lifestyle? I think that's a really interesting question. What's it going to be like?
It's a fascinating question.
Of course, the end of the pandemic probably isn't going to be very sharp, is it? We tend to think it's when the pandemic ends is that sort of phrase, but actually it's probably going to be a much more blurry end. But nevertheless, question helps.
Yeah, and obviously I don't have a way of knowing the future with any certainty, but I suspect that most of us are going to go to one of two tendencies. Some of us will go to the tendency of, I've been withdrawn for 18 months now, I'm going to find it hard to re-engage. Some of us, maybe quite rightly, have made some good adjustments to our life, and we don't want to lose those things. I'm starting gardening. I'm hoping the end of the pandemic won't mean I stop gardening again. There are some changes that I think have been good and we've learnt and will want to keep. There'll be other things that we'll just be scared of doing. I think some of us will be scared of traveling. Some of us will be scared of big gatherings. And I think we possibly will see a number of people in our communities staying relatively withdrawn. There will be a culture shock about having to go out again or being encouraged to go out again. And some of us won't want to engage with that. And we'll need to be gentle with ourselves and give ourselves time to process what's going on. But I think at the other end of the spectrum, there's going to be other people in the community who are like, normality, I need to travel the world. I'm just going to get out there. I'm going to do so much. I was reading an article just this morning, actually, in a newspaper. They're expecting a new sexual revolution come the end of this pandemic. Everyone has been so locked away that they think what the secular newspaper was considering sexual liberation. I'm not sure that it's going to be so liberating once we see the carnage of broken hearts at the end of it. But I think there's going to be those two tendencies. A lot of people, one is to stay a bit withdrawn, and the other is to just engage in ways that are possibly at times slightly reckless, because we're so pleased to be able to get out and about again.
Yeah, I have a hunch that there will be some measure of our mental health, psychological difficulties that will only emerge at that point, that we'll only notice it then. That in a sense it'll have been under wraps until that point, and I think that may be when we find the greatest sort of need in this area. Okay, we're nearly out of time, and let me just have a quick scan at other questions. Here's one sort of more specifically about your story. If I can ask this one, having experienced a challenging upbringing, did you ever feel too far gone for God? How did you get the confidence to start going to church and I suppose, engaging with the Christian faith at that stage?
Yeah, thank you. That's a lovely question, and the answer is a resounding yes. I spent a lot of those first initial 6 months assuming that God could never want anything to do with a tainted, abused addict who was just angry the whole time. I mean, we have this picture of God as someone that would only want to kind of meet up with nice, sorted people. It's not the picture that the Bible holds out of God at all, but in our minds we can often imagine that a nice religious person ought to be polite and well educated and not get drunk. And so it took my friends taking me along to church, really, for me to have the courage to go with any regularity. But even after becoming a Christian, I think for quite a long time, I still assumed that God wouldn't really want someone like me in his family. Maybe he'd let me squeak in on the edges. I could sit on the periphery maybe because he's a good and a kind God. But he wouldn't want a messy addict who was just tainted to be close to him in any way. But as you meet Jesus in the scriptures, you can see he goes out of his way to meet messy people. The songs of the Bible tell us that God draws close to the brokenhearted. And Jesus, when he was on earth, spent so much time with people that nobody else wanted to spend time with. That gradually the penny has dropped. That me having a past of messiness didn't put God off. But now I am a Christian. Actually, he doesn't see me as messy anymore. He's cleaned me up. He's forgiven me the stuff that I have done wrong. He's sorting out the things that I've done to myself. He's given me a new start. So I'm not a messy person. And you know what? My church really helped with that as well. The first few years of being a Christian, I nipped out halfway through the service to have a ciggy at the back, which probably isn't like normal church etiquette. But I needed a ciggy, so I popped out and had one. And no one batted an eyelid. They were just pleased I was there and pleased that I wanted to know more about God. And the fact that I was a bit messy, well, you know what? I'm sure I irritated a few people sometimes, but they loved me through it all.
As you describe that, I find coming to my mind is one of those stories, those parables that Jesus told of the sort of the religious and the tax collecting sinner, as they were characterized then. One saying, look at all the great things I've done, look at how marvelous I am, and the other, at a distance, not even looking up to heaven, and saying, God, have mercy on me. And Jesus saying, it's the one that is just crying out for help, and recognizing that they haven't got what it takes. That Jesus says, goes home righteous before God, and not the person puffing themselves up with their record of good deeds. Helen, we have run out of time, and I'm going to I am going to stick to our promise that we will wrap up in an hour. So thank you for your time this evening, and for your wisdom, and also your willingness to be able to share a little bit about of your own story. Appreciate all of that. Thank you very much. I'm going to just sort of close us out now with one or two other things. It occurs to me that if you actually, I meant to ask Helen about this. I was asking her earlier on. If you wanted more resources for help with mental health issues, Helen and I were talking about where to go for that. And I guess, you could go to the Mind website, the mental health charity. who've got excellent sort of online resources and leaflets. You could make use of your GP. Helen was talking about that earlier on. Those would both be good ways to get help if you want something more. If you want to find out more about the Christian faith, then I've mentioned earlier, we'd love to engage you with any questions you've got. You could email the office, or you could join us for that Christianity Explored course that Helen was and I was mentioning earlier on. Thanks for joining us tonight. You'd also be welcome to just join us on a Sunday. We are currently streaming a Sunday service at 10:15 each week. And you can, presumably you found this event on our YouTube channel, and you can find that each week on our YouTube channel as well. Just a sort of 50-minute or so time when we look at the Bible and gather together in that way online. So thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to just sort of finish up, just so it's not an abrupt end. We're just going to finish up by looking at another of those trailers for the Christianity Explored course, and then we'll be done for this evening. Thanks again for joining us tonight.
One life. What's it all about?